Hey everyone, I want to talk to you a little bit about Robert Frost. So he was born in 1874, he died in 1963, an American poet, a real part of the school of realism, and a regionalist. He wrote about a specific region, in particular New England, which is where he lived most of his life. He was a farmer. He tried to be a farmer for a little while, but it was a failed attempt, as often happens with poets somehow in things that aren't poetry. Um, he is considered, especially now, to be somewhat traditional. He had a very American view of things for the early 20th century, like individualism was very important to him. He shunned groups. He didn't like to join up with stuff and get on the bandwagon and things like that. As he grew as he became more famous with his writing, he stayed around New England. He lectured and taught at Harvard and several other colleges and universities. And he's pretty much one of the most famous American poets. He wrote a lot of his verse, a lot of his poetry in blank verse. Excuse me. Blank verse is iambic pentameter. But however, it doesn't rhyme in traditional ways. So it sounds like this, da 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 da. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen with you, and oops. So, see, and look at one of his poems, Out Out. All right, so let's see. Okay, so this poem, and we'll go through it. I'll read it, even though I'm having a coughing fit. Out, out. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other. Under the sunset, far into Vermont, and the saw snarled and rattled, as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. His sister stood beside him in her apron to tell them supper. At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However, it was neither refused the meeting, but the hand. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all. Since he was bold enough to know, big boy doing a man's work though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off, the doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath. And then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart, little, less, nothing. And that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. All right. First off, this is blank verse, so that every line has 10 syllables. It goes like this. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard. 10 syllables. We don't read it the way I just read it, though. We read it more like prose. It flows. This is called enjambment, when the line flows into the next line, and we have to pause a little bit at the end of each line. So that means that the last word has to be somewhat important, or may cause us pause. So it has to be some reason why we pause there. And then the line moves to the next line. So we don't read it as if the way I just read it. We read it the way I read it when I read the whole poem. But we can count the syllables and see that it's blank verse. All right, so let's think about the topic. So this is an early 20th century poem. And we know where it is. It's under the sunset far into Vermont. So we're in the mountains. It's obviously either the house cutting wood outside, these people, and for their own use, or maybe I've had students say that they thought it was a a lumber mill or something like that, but I don't know if there's that much evidence for that, except for that they're sawing wood with this buzz saw. All right, and so when we start to read it, we see that the language that Robert Frost uses is simple, straightforward regionalism. He talks the way he writes the way people would speak there, and he shows very clear images, not a lot of figurative language here, more literal but specific language for Robert Frost. All right. So obviously, as we're sitting here, there's a speaker or eye of the poem. That means that there's someone who's seeing this scene and telling this story. Who is it? It's not the boy, because it's not from his perspective. Let's see, and then look for it. So, and it's probably not the sister. And however, it seems to be maybe another member of the family or someone watching this scene unfold. So what happens is he's called into lunch or supper. The sister says, "Come for supper," and he turns, and somehow the saw slips, and it cuts his hand. And at first, if you've ever had that feeling of shock when something bad happens or good, well, usually not good. In this case, definitely not good. Something bad happens and you laugh. It says he gave a rueful laugh. That's like, oh my gosh, a shocked laugh. Let's put it that way. A knowing laugh. So he gives a laugh and then he grabs it, and it says, and we read, the boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half an appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. So there have been students who say that the hand is cut off. It seems to be that the hand is almost cut off. Let's put it that way, by the saw. And he, looking at his family and his sister, he says, "Don't let them cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes." So we know that this is probably not a wealthy family. They're out, chopping wood in a rural setting. During that time period in the early 20th century, there's going to be large families. Everybody's expected to pull their weight. So if he suddenly realizes, because he's a boy, it says, how old is he? I think he's 12, approximately. It says he's a boy doing a man's work. But if we think about the time period, he would be pretty young working, because that's what they did in the good old days. All right. So he's working, but he knows the reason he has a man's sensibility, although he's a boy. If his hand is cut off, how is he going to be able to do the work that he does? So he wants to make sure he saves the hand. So he says, "Don't cut it off." And it says he saw all spoiled. Don't let them cut my hand off. And when he says he saw all spoiled, he's talking about his life, or the way his life was planned out for him. All right. But so the doctor comes, and don't forget, so since this is it's a rural setting, and the doctor's going to come, and he probably has a horse and wagon. So it's going to take a little bit of time for him to get there. By the time he gets there, he puts him in the dark of ether. That means that ether is something that, it's going to give him it's a general anesthetic. It can be, and not a very well, let's put it this way. They're going to put it on cotton or a cloth and put it over his mouth until he passes out. So as far as monitoring that kind of anesthetic, even if you go to the hospital now and you get a general anesthetic, you have to sign all this paperwork just says you might die. So this is much less scientific, but it's the way they used to do it. And then it says, but the hand was gone already. And he lay in his lips and puffed his lips out with his breath. All right, so now there's a watcher at his pulse. That means someone's feeling his pulse to make sure he's okay. And his pulse goes away, and he no longer has a pulse, so he dies. And it says no one believed. They listened at his heart, little, less, nothing. And that ended it. No more to build on there. So they were surprised because they didn't think that this was actually a mortal wound necessarily. Like they were surprised that he died from this, because he was having at least it's his arm sewed up, and he should have been able to live through that. However, coupled with the ether, the loss of blood, and probably the time period that passed between when the doctor got there and when he when he died, it was probably a little bit of time. So we can maybe gather that the combination of those things caused him to die. So he lost blood. And then there's also in the back of our minds, the idea that he knows that his hand is going to get cut off and he could be giving up. Although young boys usually don't give up that easily. And then at the end of the poem, little, less, nothing, that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. So the rest of the family, clearly it sounds kind of cold. The whole poem feels, it has a cold kind of tone, but it seems very realistic, a slice of life or a slice of death, maybe, in this family, in this family's history. And the end, it doesn't seem like everybody's crying and upset. Maybe they are in their hearts, maybe they are in their minds. We don't know for sure, but we do know that during that time period in history, most families had at least one or two children die, especially in rural settings and in lower income families. So with that, we're presented with this amazing poem by Robert Frost. And I think that we can analyze it the way I analyzed it in the way that I probed the meaning of it, or we can enjoy the lines, the line breaks, the sound, the rhythm, the wonderful description. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard. There's some figurative language there, though, right? So snarled, okay, and personification. All right, or more like animal sounds, I guess. So, and then what are we left with? We're left with a scene. We're left with a region. We're left with what happened during that time period and how do we explore it or explain it. And it's something to make us think. I think it's not elusive as far as meaning goes. We can figure it out. Some poems are much more difficult to figure out, but it has more than one level and it has more than one point of view, in a way, in that we kind of know what he's probably thinking and what he is worried about. We know what the sister, what her role is, and we wish that he hadn't called for supper, been called for supper, and that little accident hadn't happened. But like when we were talking about Jack London, in a situation like this, in a life lived like this, the margin for error is small. So if something goes wrong, there's not a big hospital nearby. There's not someone to immediately take care of you. We have the bare minimum, and sometimes it just doesn't work out for the best. All right. And I think that's about it for out for now. So let's see. Thank you, and I will see you soon.